Welcome to another episode of Health Creators. This is Liv, and I'm joined here today with Hamish Grierson, founder and CEO of Thriva, empowering people to thrive through their healthcare journey. Actually, I thought Thriva existed as a fit to fly initially.
Really?
So then you were like, it's been 7 years. So obviously it existed before COVID.
Certainly did.
What was like the original concept behind Thriva? Was it called Thriva in the beginning?
Yeah, it's always been called Thriva, and the name actually says something about what the ambition of the business has always been, and effectively, it's to use biodata to enable people to thrive. Hence Thriva.
So you coined Thrive before it became what it is today.
We wanted it to have a name that was a little abstract, but without being completely disconnected to the idea. Thriva it was. And the genesis of the idea was effectively we were surrounded, myself and my two co-founders, Tom and Elliot, by a couple of very powerful truths, one of which was that in places like financial technology and fintech, there was a rapid rise of businesses that were putting customers at the heart of the solutions and having a very adult-to-adult relationship with them. On the one hand, and on the other, there was this unassailable rise of access to information. And what we became very passionate about was that was missing as a thing to exist in the world with respect to the information inside your bodies. So how do you put those two things together? How do you make your internal biodata easily accessible, easy to understand, easy to do something with, and recognize that the direction of travel for societies in general is that we're going to need that information source.
So it's about moving from this doctor knows best model essentially into one where you come into the room and you have your information that you share.
Yeah, I'd put it slightly differently. I mean, the reality of the NHS, obviously it's a big and dominant force, quite rightly, in the UK, is that it was architected originally to kind of catch people when they got sick and ensure they had access to care when that happened. And everyone for 20 years has been talking about sort of preventative and participative health. But in practice, that is just not something that is a lived reality for most people. And the company today, I consider myself very fortunate because we've been able to create a suite of solutions that, on the one hand, does power people directly. You know, we do have a D2C brand, but on the other, it also powers healthcare partners. Where whether you're a GP trying to run diabetes clinics remotely and address health inequalities, or you're a life sciences business trying to create streamlined and decentralized clinical trials. Actually, they all have a really common need, which is how do you enable the people, the patient, the participant, the user, the customer, to get easy access to that biodata. And it's really difficult. But we've built the platform that makes that easy to do.
What was that year one like? You had this idea of like, hey, we want to enable people to use their biodata to make better decisions. Okay, like where do we start?
So for context, I had a 6-year-old son. I'd just taken a mortgage and I just got married. So it was like a really bad time to start a business.
Yeah.
So year one was a bit intense, but it involved securing our first little fundraise. And then, we were incredibly lucky that one of the co-founders was himself just a very, very competent technologist. So he just built everything. And there's no two ways about it. It was very experimentation heavy. We were trying to, on the one hand, identify how to position what we were doing to people who, this is back in 2016, diagnostics in the home wasn't really something people thought about. So how do we position it in a way that gets people not just appreciative of the value, but excited enough to act? And I think, ironically, blow forward 7 years, that stood us in really good stead, because it's difficult to do that. You've got to create really delightful experiences. And on the other, we were, frantically trying to figure out the ops and logistics flows. And the complexity there was, there are big chunks of kind of operational need within the ecosystem that allows you to do testing, but none of them historically played nicely with each other. So there was no kind of plug and play network. So we had to go and integrate with a suite of laboratories, fulfillment providers. We had to, think through clinical safety and escalation protocols and regulation. And, it's a difficult business in that sense. And again, here we are in 2022. Our understanding of that ecosystem and how to build a technology wrapper that glues those component parts together is one of probably the most powerful assets that we have, because we can now expose that to lots of third parties. So it was crazy. Yeah, we were doing we were building kits and fulfilling them ourselves and walking up to the Old Street post office every day. And it was just the three of us doing everything. So it was intense. Yeah.
Because you have this array of experiments, essentially, until you reach that product market fit. And how many different variations of this do you think you ran until you really felt traction?
Do you know, it was funny. I remember, I've told this story a bunch of times, but I haven't told it for a while. We got to about 100 customers. And I realized one day that I had just completely fallen foul of the most basic 101 no. And I hadn't spoken to our customers for a month or so. And so we pinged an email out. It's not very hard because you only have 100. And we just asked for time with them on the phone. And I probably spoke to 20 or 30 customers over the course of 2 or 3 days. And we really came to understand something, which is that those early adopters were very attached to the idea of building up a longitudinal picture of their health over time. So we looked at our product offering. We were like, okay, well, it's not saying that. In fact, ironically, we were apologetic about the fact that it was going to be continuous, and there'd be the ability to do that, because there's an idea of ongoing commitment about that. So we were apologetic, and we, having had those phone calls, flipped the way that we were positioning and put subscription and the idea of regularity, even though the individual will control the cadence and the doctor will inform you as to what the cadence needs to be. And it started to take off, and we started seeing, 100% daily improvement on sort of Facebook engagement and conversion. But there was a lot of testing that just didn't work.
How long did it take you to reach that point of product market fit? And how did you know? What did it feel like? Yeah.
I think there have been different stages where we've had it, and it's been, I think, that early sort of jump of customers where retention was looking pretty solid, and our CACs were starting to become predictable, and then I think we probably went through the early adopter market, and through a phase of acquiring in the early adopter market, and that felt pretty clearly like product market fit. NPS was very high. Retention rates, as I say, were pretty stable. But then I think we actually lost it again as we sort of started to jump into the mass market, and we started recognizing that the positioning that had been working for some of the people who were early adopters wasn't going to get us into the mainstay. So that for me was certainly a point of, okay, we need to think about positioning again, which we did do. And then interestingly, on the B2B side, where we power third-party partners across the healthcare system, product market fit, we're still relatively early on that side actually, but product market fit for me is how much do you get inbound and how quickly do you convert them, because the thing that we've got really solves the problem that they've got. And that feels like where we're at now. It's amazing to think we really haven't had much marketing resource on the B2B side, but we've had, I think a pretty healthy amount of success in a short period of time, which for me suggests that there is a market and they do need the thing that we're selling. So that does feel like product market fit, but ask me again in 6 months and hopefully I'll be able to confirm that was the case.
How many years until you reach that point of like, we're getting this, like, would you describe it as like an avalanche of like growth?
I think, I don't think we've experienced that in the direct consumer business. And in fact, I don't know anyone, who is monetizing a business in our space who's gone through a sort of total J curve, and continued it. Though there are businesses that are adjacent that have experienced that, I don't think in the diagnostics landscape, parking COVID, where testing obviously was on the rise for a very different reason. I don't think businesses tend to have done that. And part of that is just education. The market is still relatively early in sort of waking up to the value of understanding what can be understood about your own body. And then so I think that's emerging. I don't think we've had that avalanche moment. We certainly did experience an avalanche moment when we sort of positioned what we were able to deliver in the B2B space, because we ended up powering lots of antibody testing within the UK system, and making sure that the government had a data set that they could rely on to be able to understand the sort of risk profile of different groups. So that was certainly an avalanche moment. And I think the B2B, the kind of solutions that we're building, they're not sort of classic B2B SaaS products where you've got a massive addressable audience and the ticket value is relatively low. It's more enterprise level. So, it's more, an avalanche is often lots of very small rocks. I think ours feels like lots of big rocks dropping. Maybe doesn't feel like an avalanche quite.
But did you do direct to consumer during COVID?
We continued to do it, yes. We chose not to invest as heavily around direct to consumer COVID testing. We did do it primarily because we wanted to make it available to our existing customers. And instead we focused on capturing what we thought was a transformative moment in healthcare. And I still think that that's true, which is as healthcare moves to the home, diagnostics has to be a part of that. How do we do that? Because at the moment, the system isn't designed to make that easy. And we built up this really strong, both technology, but also experience base that meant we could start to, bring providers, telemedicine providers, startups who've got, innovative products that need diagnostic solutions, pharmacy, insurance, life sciences, research, and the NHS themselves. We do power NHS hospitals and we do some work with GPs as well. So we invested much more heavily in that, and we continue to, because I think it's a very exciting macro shift. For our generation, I think it's going to be. We'll look back on this in 10 years' time as profound.
And was it profound for your team when you saw all of this happening, right? You were like, I've been trying to get people on daily testing for the last 5 years, right? And then everyone just started doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's, yes, it was pretty profound. I mean, it was also, it was also pretty intense because we were doing something where, we were scaling up into the millions from a handful of thousands, which just carried the most phenomenal intensity with it, because we kind of forget now, but it was wartime. We were on this attack footing to do whatever we could. Whoever you were, everyone was trying to do their bit, as were we. I remember taking a proposal to number 10, effectively saying, look, whether you use this or whether we don't, here's the playbook for what you can do with this stuff. And as it turned out, we ended up then doing some work with the government. But equally, the teams were just people, and all the people were suddenly having to grapple with remote working and onboarding people in a decentralized environment, and themselves being worried about COVID, and our lab partners being the people processing samples where they were really worried about COVID. So it was an intense time. It was not easy, and whilst I think that there are genuinely positive consequences of COVID for the health ecosystem or healthcare ecosystem, it's come at a high price. Both at a sort of local individual level, lots of people died. And the people who I think have gone through it, I think are still processing it.
Do you mean with long COVID?
I mean both. I think that it's the first. I think it's the first global event of its kind, certainly for my generation and below, I think. And I think people are still kind of grappling with it psychologically. And there are hundreds of millions of people who are grappling with it physiologically, as you say, whether it's long COVID or something similar.
Interesting. So you were testing thousands, say pre-COVID, and then during COVID scaled up to testing millions in the UK. What was like the biggest challenge of doing that? Yeah.
So I think it was what was the biggest challenge? It was probably so we were the only, I think this is true globally, we were the only end-to-end solution provider. So there were governments and private companies who would do pieces of the value chain, but we through the platform stitched together all of the pieces. But we aren't, at least not now, vertically integrated. So we were working with a suite of lab suppliers and a suite of fulfillment providers and people who actually provide the stuff that goes into the kits that you then send out the door. Distribution partners, Royal Mail, the delivery group and folks like that. And everyone was trying to do the same thing, which was to scale up.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, you had just this phenomenal incentive to make it work, because if we could make it work, we would do something powerful that would have a really positive impact. So it was, everyone really wanted to get there, but no one had done this before. So you're dealing with a supply chain who we've glued together, but themselves are going through sort of pretty radical change and scale up. And that was pretty intense, and it required a lot of very sensitive management, because these are businesses who are dealing with risk on the one hand, complexity. They're trying to judge the balance of not over-investing but not under-investing. What's going to be here to stay that lives beyond COVID, what isn't. And here we are, the piece in the middle that centralizes all of that. And, entirely appreciably, those partners were trying to find their way, as we were. But that was complex.
And when did you think, okay, we have to switch our resources now, right? Because you built up all these resources around COVID. And then at what point in that timeline, in that journey from us being in the second lockdown to normalization where you like, we've got to change. Like we've got to turn this tap off and turn this one on now. Yeah.
So I think it was probably almost exactly, that's a terrible sentence. It was almost exactly a year from the pandemic landing. So we went through, March, April, okay, this is not going away, into lateral flow testing isn't working, then the sort of working with the government to sort of bottom out what the solution could look like, and then turning it on. And that turn on happened in sort of Q3, 4. So I think it was probably 5 months of just getting that program to become stable enough. And the team were amazing. I mean, absolutely amazing. And it was a program that, again, everyone's figuring out the whole thing as new information comes up or new technology comes through. And just to be clear, I mean, the Department of Health themselves were amazing. Yeah. And the people working with them were they were doing incredible work. So by that, I suppose the anniversary of the pandemic landing, 1 year in, we were sitting down looking at the long-term trajectory here, and it was becoming very, very clear that healthcare was experiencing this shift. We were seeing, as a good sort of litmus test, the amount of telemedicine suddenly just jumped probably 80%. And whilst that was clearly not going to stay there was a recognition that technology could be adopted. It had a really valuable place in certain use cases. We had to get healthcare as a model into people's hands at home or the community. Clearly, not everywhere, and not for every use case or disease area, but we were just seeing that it could happen. Yeah. And clinicians were just doing it. And our view became, we now have to capitalize on what was then 6 years worth of experience that we built up, because we thought we could have a really, really profound positive impact. Yeah. If we invested in turning everything that we'd built into a platform that third parties could plug into, knowing also that we would be able to borrow from our direct-to-consumer technology and experience as well. Yeah. Because sometimes it will be true that you need to figure out how to engage people, and you need to figure out how to present information back to them, and you need to know how to think about safety and security and what you can and can't automate to keep costs down and quality up. So we felt like that was the time. So it's probably a year in.
Like March 21.
Thereabouts, yeah.
Yeah. And what was the first kind of post-COVID use case?
So it was, ironically, it was an extension of something that had started pre-COVID. And there was a really pioneering operator at a hospital in southwest London at the Royal Brompton, a wonderful man who had a specialist area in cystic fibrosis. And he'd contacted us in, I think it was 2018, maybe even earlier than that, and sort of said, look, we've got this group of patients who we would like to keep at home if we can, because they have a compromised immunity, and putting them into a phlebotomy clinic in a hospital exposes them to risk that we would like to alleviate. So we'd been working with that one hospital and with a group of patients, empowering them to test at home. And that expanded from 1 to 4 hospitals within a really short space of time. Yeah. And that then jumped into another area where there was an appetite to do pulmonary hypertension testing at home, and we had to do some validation work. So the sort of the click across from that one condition area into others, and diabetes followed that fairly soon after. And I think the use case after that was research and life sciences. So the truth of the matter, I think, is that we're sitting at, that's why this conversation with you is so interesting. We're sitting at a fascinating point in time where our ability to collect data at scale is unprecedented. And we've got the computational power to actually divine some really quite meaningful insights from it, and to connect that back into a whole slew of different applications, whether it's the way you fine-tune drug usage or digital therapeutic there's a whole amazing slew of things that come with that. And we now work as a preferred supplier with a really big CRO who themselves, I think, just see the value of where that will go over time. So that was another big use case. And then they sort of filed in after that.
Could Thriva become a digital twin model?
Good question. I mean, I think our place will be, I think there's a really, this is around the houses way of answering your question, Liv, but I think there's a really fascinating coming together of B2C and B2B in our business, but I think it'll happen in others too, where the data that we're collecting in the direct-to-consumer context will have value for the people that are the owners of that data. And I think that those individuals, if given the appropriate choice and empowered to make an informed decision, may be able to extract value from that data by working with third-party partners. Because actually, how good we get at personalization, obviously a bit of a buzzword, but what is personalization going to be governed by? It's going to be governed by understanding more about individuals. Now, what data sets we collect today versus what we'll be able to collect in 12, 18, 24 months time will continue to expand. So to your question on digital twin, I think that there will be a number of providers, not one, that will need to feed into the idea of a digital twin. Would we like to get there? Yeah, probably. But, I think we've got enough to do to contend with the complexity of the current opportunity before going entirely into that space.
Yeah, I guess where I saw the opportunity was it's not necessarily the collection that's useful. I think a huge number of data is being collected on us today already, but it's the combination and the analysis.
Sure.
Right? Because
I agree with that.
It's the interface, because data is not inherently useful if you're just looking at it. It's more like, how do these different factors actually impact me?
Yeah, quite right. And we find, and again, this is some of what I was alluding to with respect to using our B2C heritage with B2B partners in healthcare. We've figured out how to turn a frankly, completely unintelligible data set from a lab result of some kind into a meaningful, I can actually pick this up and know what to do with it, delivered responsibly, so you're not spooking people and creating inappropriate concern. That's not that easy to do. And the so what of a diagnostic is always going to be the most important thing. As you say, the information in isolation is only ever going to be so useful. So yeah, and we've been doing that on the B2C side of the business for many years. And how you advance the science, I think, is also fascinating. So we've got, in the way that we present result data, as an example, optimal ranges, not just standard lab ranges. And it's those sorts of things where we've got the data and it's proprietary because we've been able to collect it from on behalf of our customers. And we can use it anonymously to build predictive models. So you don't even need to take a test, but we can say, look, you answer these questions and we'll be able to have a fairly decent sense of, in fact, it's with a 95% degree of accuracy, so it's a very decent sense of, where you may be from a testing perspective. Use of the data is for sure a huge value add. It's just what will be the first really transformative use cases, I think, is still being determined.
How do you deal with the risk factor in terms of, hey, we identified a biomarker that could mean that you have Alzheimer's, but we aren't, legally allowed to say that you have it? Is there a component of that?
Yeah, there is for sure. And look, I think the there was an article in the BMJ recently that shone a light on some of this. And there's a reality to the fact that if you wanted to just put lab testing in the hands of the consumer, and you could do that. I personally believe that that's wholly inappropriate to not think through exactly the sort of use cases that you're talking about. The way that we approach it is by, first of all, thinking through that question and trying to make it very clear that when we take a test on for an individual, that it's an appropriate test to be running for them. And also the way we'll present the information back, it's been reviewed by a GP.
Yeah.
I mean, in the D2C context, that happens all the time. We explain as best as we possibly can what a test can't tell you. And we therefore make sure when the result information comes back, it is responsibly delivered. So it doesn't do that thing of saying, here's something that you either can't do anything about and doesn't make any sense and it may worry you. And at the other, if we do find something that is concerning, we have
someone you can call.
Yeah, a sort of ranking system. We will go all the way up to working with the emergency services to contact you. So there's it's patient safety. I mean, that's the sort of the category of process here. We have an army of clinicians who are wonderful and think very carefully about that stuff.
Are they linked to the NHS? Because when you tell me this, I'm thinking, how do you even get time from these clinicians, right? Because I'm guessing as like a patient, you maybe get a result and you're like, okay, now I want to see a clinician about it. Call up the NHS and they'll be like, okay, our first available appointment is in like 3 months.
Yeah. So, I mean, it depends on the use case. If it's a B2B customer, if it's, us doing testing for the NHS, that's all within their own ecosystem anyway. So I think that problem exists much less there. And the same thing where we're powering a third party who themselves are a solution provider of any kind. In the B2C context, when we do suggest that someone picks it up with their GP because we found something that is worrying, you're right. That's something that, first of all, we try to do as little of as we can do, recognizing that the only time we should do it is where we have a real reason to believe that someone's picked something up that is a concern. And right now, that is potentially causing a problem because the access is challenged. So we are doing some work, actually funny enough, right now to look at ourselves being able to provide access to that specialism. It's a private solution in the sense that it's not then linking back into the NHS. And look, ultimately, I think that the optimal solution is a hybrid one where you have both, because there will be people who either can't or don't want to pay for a service like that, or at least don't want to pay in addition to their taxes. So I think you have to be able to say, in the fullness of time, you've got options. You could speak to someone maybe over a telemedicine consultation, or you may want to go and speak to your doctor.
Interesting. I don't know if this is like a debate within the industry or like micro industry, but what do you think when people say that Thriva is not really a remote solution because you still need healthcare professionals who facilitate the tests?
So just to be really specific on our model. So there's no physician approval in the B2C context when you order it. That's different regulatorily in the States. That is required. Our physicians do play a part in the review of results and commentary on results. So I think
But it's not self-collection now, is it?
So the samples are self-collected. So there is no physician.
I see. But it's just that you have to send it to a lab still.
That's correct, yeah. So the business actually today is omni-channel. We have kits that we can send out that arrive through your door. You do the whole thing by yourself. The sample goes back to a laboratory, then you post it. We can also send a nurse out anywhere in the UK with a partner. And we have the first stages of a drop-in network where you can go on the high street and someone will do a venous draw for you. Yeah. So again, is there a silver bullet here that just makes the whole thing very predictable and straightforward? No. Yeah. The solution will very likely for the next 2, 3, 4 years be omnichannel. And all it really is requiring of is careful thought about what's the right collection modality for a particular use case. So, if you're in clinical trials and you want to do screening, actually screening can be really difficult, very expensive. If you're trying to find a very specific population who, say, have a particular lipids profile, or it's a vitamin D reading in a particular season, or just keep going, right? Things that we otherwise probably don't have on people. Well, with a self-collection kit, you could collect a substantially larger amount of data by posting people kits that they can do themselves. There's no rate limiting factor from a clinician perspective in that sense, and may completely change the way that screening can happen. But then there are use cases where you're running a clinical trial, just follow the example, where you've got a really, really specific, highly, highly sensitive drug being administered, let's say, to a child, where there is still a diagnostic need. Is that appropriate for them to do at home? Absolutely not. You're still going to want to have a much more white glove concierge service supporting that. Probably analogous to what happens today. Yeah.
From my perspective, it's maybe the accuracy component, right? So when you were talking about Thriva needed to step in to support COVID because lateral flow testing, a lot of false positives and false negatives. So I guess it's that component of, hey, we have a 95% degree of accuracy that is required in some of these
that's
cases.
right. And so we are, if you think about the value chain, so we integrate with UCAS accredited laboratories. So the testing that they provide us with, they will be able to provide the NHS with. The additional layer that we've been working through over the course of the last 12 months is actually building up a proprietary data set on our side, in addition to any data that the labs have, because actually we'd like to be able to cut it according to different statistical frameworks, so that we can see, are there different applications that make sense here, depending on how good or bad the data is for a particular analyte. And look, the reality is that if you do something at home, or you're looking at the prism of what can be done at home, there is absolutely a truth that not 100% of tests will be suitable for self-collection at home.
Yeah.
It's a very broad range that are, but there will be some that are not well suited to it. So you just have to understand what those thresholds are, and as a consequence, be able to put a solution in front of people that allows for that to be the case. So, okay, this needs to be done as a venipuncture, and it needs to be stabilized straight away with a centrifuge. Okay, what does that mean? Well, you need to either have someone going to the house with a centrifuge machine in the van outside, or they need to be in a hospital environment, or it's just not the same solution, and that's okay. So it's just as straightforward. Takes time to build, but it's as straightforward as saying, what does the data tell you? What's robust? What therefore can you bring to solutions as a self-collection versus needing assistance? What are the time parameters in terms of stability, and putting those as a rules engine into the business?
Yeah, I see kind of two different channels you can go down, or two different methods, right? So the initial is almost like the pre-screen test, right? To reduce screen failure rates. So you would say, hey, let's just build a low fidelity test that gives us less accuracy, but we can screen out anyone who's definitely not eligible for the study. And then the second one would be, hey, we have a number of individuals who regularly use Thriva to check their health. We have already done the analysis and understand the different biomarkers involved and risk factors involved in these individuals. We can get these individuals involved in the clinical trial and then bypass the pre-screening.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think, the first use case of bringing together B2C and B2B, because there's quite rightly some sort of moral and ethical questions that need to be addressed in how consumer data would be used in any of those contexts. But I think it's just about choice, right? And having an adult to adult conversation with people to say, if you opt into something like this is what it will mean for you. And this is what it may contribute to. And a model that hasn't been explored successfully yet is how might we share the upside with the consumer if it's the B2C context? If indeed there is upside being created, I think it's a really fair question to ask. And look, 23andMe have done I think a very credible job of proving that you can deliver a good service to a customer and equally build up data that has value to a third party that I think really advances the science. And if you look at, obviously 23andMe have done some relationship building with GSK. A lot of, if you read the GSK annual report, there's a huge amount of 23andMe's data set referenced there. So it clearly has value, and we hope will be a key driver of better, personalized, more effective, less harmful drugs in this particular context. I'm particularly fascinated by not just drug development, but the broader area of trials to find solutions that may not just be drugs. And I think our data set will have a really meaningful role to play there.
You mean in medical devices, DTX?
Yeah, and it's a very broad playing field. But I mean, you and I started this conversation talking about intermittent fasting, right?
We did.
So where does that go? What is that? It's not a medical device, clearly, because you just don't eat. What does the research suggest around that as a protocol? Are there stress relieving protocols that may or may not involve the drug, may or may not involve a drug and a digital therapeutic, may or may not involve a drug, a digital therapeutic, and a combination of that plus something else. So I believe that industry is waking up and is fascinating, and I'd love to play a part in it. But it's not, to my mind anyway, just about diagnostics.
Interesting. And how much advice does Thriva give, right? Because you guys could easily become a DTX as well, right? So you have all these people, they come and they get their results every month. To what extent could you not just be like, hey, why don't you sleep a little bit more every night, and maybe this number will drop, or maybe this number will increase, and then suddenly you become a DTX, right? Yeah.
So we actually do that now, but we do it deliberately under the auspices of lifestyle advice.
Yeah.
So there is a sort of a category where it's permissible to
habituation versus basically.
Yeah, what you're not saying is we've diagnosed this and this is how we're going to treat it. Now, interestingly, as a business, we're moving into wanting to do that because we now see that there is an appropriate context in which actually doing that is just better for the customer, or better for the patient, or better for the participant. And some of that dovetails to your earlier question. Why would we do that? Well, if we can be the provider of the solution and alleviate some of the pressure from the NHS, providing people are willing to support that, from our perspective, that's absolutely right. We should be able to give people that choice. So we're stepping into that. But historically, though, we've been able to produce good insights around exactly what you described. These are the things that are clinically evidenced to have a potential impact that would improve your results. And we've pushed the envelope quite far there. So if there is clinical substantiated evidence that proves that mindfulness and meditation is a risk mitigant to your cholesterol levels, we will surface that to people. Now, what we haven't said is you've got a diagnosed X and therefore treatment of Y, because we haven't needed to do that to add value. But as I say, fullness of time, we're sort of treading into that area carefully, because it is complex and you have to have patient safety at the forefront of your considerations. But it is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different routes you can take with this. So it's interesting because I guess is the ultimate goal that we create a system where everyone becomes like a regular screener, essentially. Like it just becomes part of your daily lifestyle. You know, I wake up in the morning, I check my phone, and then I screen to make sure that I'm, you know, catching anything I can. Right. Yeah.
I think there's a really dystopian version of the future and a really utopian version of the future. And look, I have the great privilege to run a technology company, but I don't spend much time on social media. Yeah. And I draw that analog because I think there is absolutely a risk of over-testing or over-insighting, if I can call it that.
Over-insight.
I think we've got a ways to go before that becomes a real problem on a generalized basis. But if you sort of push that into what I think is a more utopian view, which maybe, you're going to get some stuff that's read out, every half second from your wearables. And eventually we might have sensors that sit inside the body constray.
Neuralink.
Maybe Neuralink. Some form of bio-nanotech that will give us some readouts. And we're 25% of the way there. We've got Freestyle Libre technology that gives us continuous glucose readouts. It's just that it doesn't last for very long. And, we're not full cyborgs just yet. So just to round out, I think there is a data set that will be dynamic and coming at you pretty live and will be really, really powerful. I don't think you need to be doing the kind of testing that we do on a daily basis. I think that would be wrong on a generalized basis. But I do think that much more ready access to the kinds of testing that will have a transformative effect on you is coming, and I think will be really, really powerful and really positive for people. So, I've got 3 kids, and we were talking about the amount of germs that pass back and forth. Yeah, there is no ready access to the technology that informs whether you should be taking your child down the path of a drug or not. Right? Here is I see. A drug that might contribute to antimicrobial resistance, but how much confidence do you have as a clinician or as a parent to make that choice? That it's very basic, but just understanding that alone would, I think, be really powerful. Where is my biology today? I think is a question that lots of people will grow up appreciating. We will will know a lot more about. But we do have to be careful not to make people exist through the prism of testing alone, because that feels very dystopian.
Well, because we create a world of like WebMD warriors, essentially.
Yeah, and look, I think that actually sort of plays into the dystopian view, right? Which is too much information and not enough actionable, sort of stress-free direction. Yeah. And I do think the industry has to be very careful not to go there. But I think we're at sort of 1%. I think the risk shows up at 75% of this stuff coming to fruition. We've got a very, very long way to go before most people, just on a general basis, have any idea what's happening inside their bodies. Yeah. We've got a national health check program in the UK that kicks in at the age of 45. And national take-up rates oscillate between 10 and 25, 30%. So even the thing that we do have that's designed to be sort of participative and preventative, maybe isn't doing quite what it could.
Yeah, I know this is going full circle now, but does that mean like the initial people that used Thriva were maybe a little bit more hypochondriac? And like, if testing kind of creates this like worry and frustration, did you get like also interesting calls from people about?
Do you know what's interesting? I think we probably did have some people who were sort of self-styled hypochondriacs, and I had a couple of phone calls in that early 100 of people who would talk about that. And actually, what was really interesting is that it contributed to nullifying their concerns, because they could prove to themselves
that I'm fine,
that things were okay. Yeah. And actually maintaining that view, even if they then decided to as I always say, eat burgers and drink beer. They did so knowledgeably, like they knew where they were for some of the sort of key risk determinants. But also there was a huge number of people, and I think that group is much, much bigger now than it was in 2016, where they simply understand the value of building a longitudinal picture of their health. Yeah. Full stop. And that's nothing to do with being more concerned than they should be. It's just, them taking a pretty logical view that my health is my problem, and I'm going to do what I can to understand what's true for me and then make some decisions on the back of that. And I think the future is a positive one as a consequence of that. People are starting to appreciate that that's a thing to be encouraged and supported, right? We shouldn't be trying to do that down.
So your goal with Thriva is not to create this dystopian
Gattaca. No, very much not, Liv. I mean, I think I think businesses in any of the adjacent spaces to the ones we play in have to keep a really, really firm handle on that risk. Are we testing the right people in the right way, responsibly? Very high clinical, a very high degree of clinical input. I think if you do that, then you do it responsibly. You can mitigate that as a reality for sure. But it is a risk. It's one of those things that I think any industry, and I reference social media because I think the problem with social is that it was adopted with no handbrakes. There was no stopping to say, I wonder how this is going to affect teenage depression and anxiety. And we're at a point now where I don't know how we'd put a handbrake on that. So I think we owe it to ourselves to not fall foul of the same thing and make sure
diagnostics.
Well, I'd put it as sort of as health data. I think it's broader than just diagnostics. I think that plays a part. But I'm sure Oura Ring have people who are a bit too addicted to the data, and you hear stories about people who use sleep tracking devices who sleep worse as a consequence of the stress about the data they might get the next day if they haven't slept well, and therefore they don't sleep well. So there's this,
you're biasing the results essentially.
Correct. You're not achieving the thing that you're ultimately trying to achieve, which is in that case for people to sleep better, right? I think that the demand is going to continue to be there because it's human. I think we've got a really a deeply ingrained desire to get more out of our short time on Earth. I think that's pretty generically true and motivating, and informs how we act as individuals. So the question is simply how do you empower and add rather than subtract?
And you've been doing this for 7 years now. Do you think you've achieved what you've wanted to achieve so far? Or what are like what's the number one thing you still have left on your
to do
Thriva bucket list?
Yeah.
It's a long list. Honestly, I think we're just getting going. I think we've got a huge amount of value still to add. I think the number one thing that I think a huge amount about is the data. And there's a lot of stuff that has to happen to make that a really interesting area to explore. Lots of the technology inside the infrastructure, the automation, the safety, the regulatory permissions and changes. There's a lot of stuff that has to make the data available, or has to happen to make the data available. But I think it's fascinating, right, for all the reasons that we talked about. And we've just brought on board a new head of data who sort of comes out of or comes from a background where I think we're going to start getting into some of that. So haven't really scratched the surface, and excited about lots of things. But if you made me pick one, I'd pick data.